Presentation is on the Spanish colonies. This is a rather relatively obscure subject. Lots of people do British or French colonies, and I did a previous presentation on the Portuguese colonies. And I wasn't too enthusiastic about doing this. They look pretty boring, and they are sort of boring, but there's also a lot of interesting things there. So I hope you will enjoy what I'm going to tell you about. So this is a quick summary of what's in the Scott catalog. There are 18 of them, and they have issues from 1854 to 1975. And we're going to go through them more or less one by one at a somewhat later point in the presentation. Talking about colonies, we often think, when we think about European expression, about Columbus in 1492, sailed the ocean blue. That really wasn't the start of European expansion. So we have a little quiz now. So who's going to give us better information about when European expansion started?
Portuguese, going over to Africa and to Asia.
You've got that's partially true. There's earlier than that, though.
Well, there were people who traveled from the British Isles to Nova Scotia, Newfoundland. And did establish colonies.
Well, the Vikings, Iceland was not occupied by any Europeans until the 9th century. And they went to Greenland in the 10th century. And then, as you said, they got actually to North America in the late 10th and early 11th century, briefly. But there's more. Crusades established small colonies in the Levant in the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries. And then we do get to Portugal. Portugal started earlier than any other European country in a more or less systematic attempt to gather colonies. So Spain does not begin in the Americas with Columbus, but with the Canary Islands was the first Spanish colony. It's 100 miles off the coast of Africa. Interestingly, the Canary Islands we have records that the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and the Carthaginians all visited the Canary Islands. They were not unknown to Europe in, quote, the Dark Ages or the ancient world. And it says, I haven't looked into this too much, but the Romans actually established a colony there at one point.
There was a native group there called the Guanche, and they were like the local Indians. They were not African, they were European. So some of those Phoenicians and some of those Greeks and what have you eventually formed this tribe called the Guanche. Guanches were treated pretty much the way American Indians were treated.
Yes, well, they did. There was an African input because some of the languages there are Berber languages. But anyway, it was the islands were visited from the 14th century early on, but it wasn't done in a systematic manner until 1402, when the Spanish actually landed soldiers and took over the place. And as you said, there were natives there. They had quite a bit of for many years with the natives. It became important because it was a place the ships could take off for the Americas, because that's the way where the trade winds were blowing. So the ships from Spain and Portugal would go south to the Canaries, and then they could go across to Brazil and the Caribbean. This is an interesting historical fact. Franco was the general commander of the Canaries when the Civil War started. So that's where he was. He had his army post there in the Canaries. It's been what they call an autonomous community of Spain from 1982. The various colonies changed the nature of their colonization, and so now it's considered to be a part of Spain. And it does have stamps. The stamps are listed under Spain Revolutionary issue. They're all airmails, and they're all overprinted on Spanish stamps. And there's the first page of the Spanish stamps. And also, another piece of the Canary Islands, Santa Cruz de Tenerife. And like the Canary Islands in general, it had issues during the Spanish Civil War. It's interesting, it also has the highest mountain in Spain. Tide 12,188 feet is higher than any peak in the Pyrenees. So if you want to know what's the highest point in Spain, it's in the Canary Islands, hundreds of miles away.
Actually, it has some good skiing, too.
It does have an important European observatory there, because on the top of that mountain, you're above the inversion layer, so you get much better viewing. And it's listed like the Canary Islands as a revolutionary issue.
Are all of the so-called revolutionary overprints, were they all made by the Francoists, or did the other factions in the Civil War issue any
I
stamps?
believe that what Scott lists are the Francoist issues. If you get the Spanish catalog, there's a tremendous number of local issues of one sort or another on both sides. So the Scott listing is very restricted. And so this particular set of Spanish stamps is almost all of the revolutionary issues are on this particular set of stamps. So that's another part of the Canaries. And that's where we'll leave that alone for now. So in the beginning, this was the bulk of the Spanish overseas empire, Latin America, as we call it these days. Columbus started out having the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy. It was decided in 1524, after the Aztecs had been conquered by Cortez, that he had too much power. Then in 1525, the Pope very kindly divided the world between Spain and Portugal. The line ran more or less down this way, which is why the Brazil is Portuguese. And it ran all the way over the top of the world and down the other side, which is why Spain was allowed to have the Philippines, because it was on the same hemisphere of the world. So they were divided up in various things. There were Viceroyalty of New Spain, Viceroyalty of Peru. Florida got its own government in 1565. The Philippines was a captaincy general. And then there was this thing called the Iberian Union, in which the king of Spain became also the king of Portugal. And so for about 80 years, 60 years, all of the Portuguese colonies were, in a sense, also Spanish colonies. And then they broke off from Peru, several other viceroyalties north and south of Peru proper. And during that union, this is what the Spanish-Portuguese Empire looked like. As you can see, the Portuguese were mostly various settlements on the coast for trading purposes, but they had moved inland in Brazil to a fair extent. These green things is what we're going to be discussing, actually, because these are what is left over when the Spanish got around to issuing stamps. So most of the empire disappeared. In fact, the Decay, they lost, of course, Latin America in the early 19th century. Then they had the Spanish-American War, in which they lost the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Mariana Islands. And then decolonization, which happened in the early decades after the Second World War. So what's left are considered to be integral parts of Spain, none of whom, except for that Canary Islands items I showed already, issued stamps. Melilla and Ceuta are two towns on the coast of Morocco. Ceuta was originally conquered by Portugal, and then when there was a union of the Iberian Union, it was the only piece of the former Portuguese colonies that decided they wanted to be with Spain instead of with Portugal. Melilla was part of the province of Malaga. Ceuta was part of the province of Cadiz. And then in 1995, they passed these laws about these autonomous regions of Spain, and they got that status. And of course, the Moroccans say, no, these belong to us, but they haven't done anything about it, militarily anyway. I'm going to go a lot into the issue, what I call shared issues, which is stamps, series of stamps that were issued that were used by several colonies rather than just one. Some of these issues are virtually identical, other than the colony name. In fact, one of them is very difficult, which we'll get to that very shortly. Some are mostly just very similar in makeup. And they're very boring. The Spanish colonies are very boring because they have all of these long sets, 20 or 30 stamps. And in some cases, they issued year after year after year, very long, boring pictures of, as we'll see, mostly Alfonso XIII. Here we have some stamps that look like they're basically the same stamp, and they are. The design is the same. However, one of them is Spanish, and one of them is Cuban. Now, how do you tell apart? How are they what? These both have the first monarch of Spain, Isabel II, who was queen for quite a while. She became queen because her father, Ferdinand VII, issued a decree that reversed the so-called Salic laws, which applied in most of the European continental countries, which is that only males could succeed to the throne. So he had no children, he had no sons. So he issued this decree which allowed his daughter to become a queen of Spain. His brother said, no, this is no good. You know, we can't have a queen. And if you look at the back of this listings for Spain, you'll find that there are what they call Carlist stamps. And his name was Carlo. And so those stamps show him. And so he was leading various kinds of civil war against Isabella for the early part of her reign. Before her, the monarch of Spain had been one of these divine kings. And during her reign, she accepted a constitution. So it's the start of a constitutional role in Spain. Now, which is which? Anyone here want to know or wants to guess?
The difference is in the denomination, right?
That is the correct answer. The papers, there were three sets of these. The first watermarked loop on blue paper, the second unwatermarked, and the third watermarked crossed lines. And there are the same three issues for Spain and the colonies. And so Cuba used a reals plata instead of reals. And it's only really a problem on the one real because the smaller things, the Spanish used cuartos, and the Cuban used half of a real. And the only confusion is on the denomination is how it's spelled on the Cuban stamps, Real de Plata. And don't ask me what that F is, I don't know. Or it's slightly different. The Cubans are gray-green and green, and the Spanish ones are green-blue, greenish-blue, and blue. So those are other clues you can figure out. I actually had one of the Cuban stamps in my Spanish album. So I was very annoyed at that. Okay, the 1862 issue, which follows this 1855 to 57 issue, is also very confusing, but it's not nearly as confusing as these two, which the denomination is really the only clear key that you can get because of color problems. But in either case, none of these are as bad as France 1 through 13 and French colonies 9 through 14, which are essentially the same stamp, and it's tiny differences between the colonial and the French issues. And Scott particularly says, you should get these expertized to prove that they're Spanish colonial ones, or French colonial ones rather than French stamps. There are a number of issues with the Isabella issues. The early colonies all have Isabella issues that are very similar to the Spanish ones, but this one was the one that's particularly difficult to deal with, so I use this as an example. Isabel II was deposed in 1868. The Spanish council or parliament, I'm not sure what the name was at that point, met and they decided we need a new king. And they looked around and there were a couple of years of negotiations. Finally, the second son of Victor Emmanuel II, the king of Italy, he had just become king actually in 1870, they elected him king. So he was an elected king, appointed king. His reign was not happy. The Carlists were still around. There were Republican movements, and finally he just got sick and tired of it and says, "I'm resigning," and he went back to Italy. And the result was that the first Spanish Republic. So there's a number of issues that have his picture on the stamp. Spain, it's a different frame than this stamp. The picture is the same. So the Philippines and Cuba each stamps having King Amadeo on. They're the only colonies that were issuing stamps at this point. There's the Philippines example. All right, there was a military coup that overthrew the Spanish Republic, and then this stamp was issued for Spain, Cuba, and Philippines again to its so-called peace issue, saying that okay, things are resolved now. We're back to having a monarchy. Isn't that nice? Let's have a. Now we start in with the horrors of the Alfonsos. This is Alfonso XII. He was only king for 11 years. So it's not as bad as Alfonso XIII, who was king for 45 years. So this is the first issue showing his face. He was the son of Isabella, who had been forced off the throne and so they restored the Bourbon monarchy. Spain, again, the same portrait on their stamps, but the framing was different than the colonies. And this framing was the framing used in the colonies. So you have Philippines. Scott, for the Philippines, lists a stamp that looks much like this, and they don't tell you really what the differences are, if there are any. As far as I could tell from the Scott illustration, it's the same stamp. There's no reason to show a new example of it. Cuba had the year, the name at the top of the stamps, as well as the name of the country. Puerto Rico, ditto, but it was 1877 instead of 1876. Now, this is the first issue of Spain that was dated, and depending on which colony you're looking at, you have an 1877 version, an 1878 version, and an 1879 version. I don't think there's any country that has all three of those, but in many of the countries, you've got another set, the same set of stamps, but just a different date on them. In 1880, mostly, they issued this version that looks very much like the same portrait, but the frame, again, is different. And for Cuba, you have the interesting problem that in 1882, they've invented retouches to this stamp. And the retouches have their own catalog, full catalog, major catalog numbers. So you've got 4 sets of the Cuban stamps of this design. And then Puerto Rico, the 1880 issue had the date at the top, but again, they issued it again in 1882 through 88, and they took the date off, and they didn't put a new date. And in several of these places, there was also an 1881 issue. So you had set after set. Now, we're going to start with the horrible Alfonso XIII. Now, Alfonso XIII was not born when his father, the King Alfonso XII, died, where they had a regency, and the child, the King of Spain, was actually in his mother's womb still. And his reign ended with the Second Spanish Republic being declared, and he advocated and went abroad. And it's sort of interesting, during the Second World War, he was a member of the European Peace Commission, trying to bring an end to the war. He's the only monarch who was ever nominated for a Nobel Prize, Nobel Peace Prize. So he was not really all that nice of a guy, but apparently he was working for peace, so they decided to nominate him for this. This set, with the child, picture of him as a child, has the most values of any of the Spanish or Spanish colonial sets. Again, the Spanish issues are framed a little bit differently than the colonial issues. And Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico all have this particular set, and they were the main colonies at that point, left after the Spanish-American War. This one is the nastiest of the bunch. This is a later child photo, not quite as bad as not quite as young as the one we just seen. The typography of the stamps differs a bit. This Philippines one is a little unusual in having serifs and heavy and shaded typography for the right and the left side of the portrait. Mostly there's it's very simple typography, but the portrait's the same, the framing is the same. This is the design that has the most sets. The sets go from 1898 to 1905. And I believe there's one, I don't remember, one of the countries I think has all of them. So they have like 9 sets of this stupid stamp. And it's a pain in the butt because they're like 15 values for every set. Most of them are like, the earliest ones are like this, which just says 1898 and 99. They were issued in 1898, however. But Fernando Po, which we'll get to, I'll tell you some more about shortly, had 1899. They didn't have an 1898. The Marianas Islands, the Spanish stamps for the Marianas Islands are one set overprinted on the Philippine issue. Spanish Guinea had 1902 with the number, with the date up the top. In 1903, they reissued it without the date. They didn't say 1903 even. Elo Bay, misspelled. Anaban and Corsico in 1903, Rio Doro 1905. But some of the earlier countries that issued the stamps then issued more sets again and again and again, with just the date being different. I don't know that half the stamps in Spanish colonies are this stamp, but there are a lot of them. They're very, very boring. Then in 1907, the king had grown somewhat older, and they issued a new set of stamps. basically the same design. Spanish Guinea is now called Spanish Continental Guinea. Notice this under the eye here. Notice this extra line here. This is, I guess, is a freak. This is not an actual error. It's just a printing error. Fernando Po, Spanish Guinea, a little bit Anaban and Corsica, all of which are in the bight of Africa, and Rio de Oro, which is on the west coast of Africa. 1909, they did it again. They have several issues that look like this. This is the one that has palm trees, and the Spanish Guinea and Rio de Oro, and they're now having Spanish territories in the Gulf of Guinea instead of the previous inscription. Well, the inscriptions and the name, the way exactly they're characterizing the colony, it changes. 1912, Spanish Guineas and Rio de Oro. 1914, Spanish Guinea and Rio de Oro. 1919, Spanish Guinea and Rio de Oro. This is what I call the big head stamp because the portrait is larger on this than the other ones. 1920, Spanish Guinea and Rio de Oro. This time with notice the upper right, it has a date in it as well. Although it's never issued any other date. 1922, Spanish Guinea, Rio de Oro, and this little thing called La Agüera date is in the upper right. And finally, this is the last definitive issue. This is only issued for Spanish Guinea, but this is the only Franco portrait that you'll find in the Spanish colonies up to 1940, after he was fully in control. All right, now here we are going. We'll go over each of the countries. This is a map of the Philippines, the main possession of, basically the only possession of Spain in Asia. Magellan, like we'll see his name again, he's the one who, quote, discovered the place. It was lost in the Spanish-American War. The Americans had guerrilla war that they fought against insurgents in the Philippines. But the way Scott treats the stamps for the Philippines is they do not list the U.S. stamps as Philippines American occupation. They are just listed as part of the regular Philippines. And we'll see that again. Again, they were occupied by Japan, and now the Japanese occupation stamps were listed as occupation stamps with N numbers. And in 1946, it became independent and ceased to be a colony. Here's the first page of the Philippines. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines all had very similar stamp designs. You see the several different Victoria designs, and here I showed you this Amadeo stamp before, and that's the Amadeo set for Philippines. This is a very strange first day cover from Japanese occupied Philippines. It's a first day cover. They are printed in English. That are the stamps that look very much like the American airmail stamps, but they're slightly different. And they were issued by the American occupation forces and then overprinted by Japan. And then you've got the pass by censor, because this cover, strange though it looks, was mailed during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. Here's Cuba. We're familiar with Cuba. Again, it was discovered by Columbus in 1492, and again lost to the United States. And like the Philippines, they list the U.S. stamps as just Cuban stamps. They don't list them as occupation stamps. And it got its independence in 1902, most early of the countries that the United States took over for a while. Cuba, here's even more of the Isabella stamps, very similar to the stamps of Spain, but not identical. Here's an indication. This whole top of the page, the child issues of Alfonso XIII, and here is the first of those horrible Alfonso XIII, young but not a child anymore. After in 1862, the Spanish stamps started having the country name or something else put on them, like Comunicaciones. Cuba from 1877 on has Cuba on them, so there's no longer any possibility of wondering which country stamps you have. Here's a close-up island of Fernando Po. We'll get a couple good maps later showing you exactly where it is. But it's a volcanic island in the Bight of Benin off the coast of Cameroon. Portuguese discovered this. The Portuguese had it for several hundred years. The Dutch were also ensconced there. It was a major center for the slave trade. In 1778, there was a treaty which were various conflicts were settled between Spain and Portugal, and they got Fernando Po as part of that deal. The British, after they abolished slavery, occupied the island and used it as a base to raid the various slavers who were still operating in the area. It became part of Spanish Guinea. We'll see the history of Spanish Guinea is very confused. It was still part of Guinea between 1960 and 1968. But even though it was part of Spanish Guinea, it could have used the Spanish Guinea stamps. It issued its own stamps during that particular period. And in 1968, when they were all decolonized, it became part of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. And this town up here on the north, Malabo, even though it's on an island, and the island is considerably smaller than the continental part of Equatorial Guinea, that is the capital of Equatorial Guinea. So here's the first page of the first issues, and you'll see that these are the Alfonso XII issues, except number 1, which I don't have. That was the only Isabella issue. It was not part of those countries that were lost in the Spanish-American War. It was the only country other than Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Philippines that had an Isabella. Puerto Rico, we're all sort of familiar with Puerto Rico. This was it turned out to be the major base for the Spanish military operations during the various colonial wars that went on. The Portuguese took it briefly in 1593. Again, it was lost in the Spanish-American War. The people of Puerto Rico became U.S. citizens in 1917. There are various types of association with the United States that Puerto Rico has. I believe right now it's technically a commonwealth, whatever the hell that means. They have had several different referendums on what their status wants to be, and they never change it. So I guess we're stuck with it. And here's the first page, and you see it starts with the Amadeo stamps, Puerto Rico. Notice how they spelled differently on this. So the old Scott albums had a number of differences from what we're used to these days. The Mariana Islands were a dependency, basically, of the Philippines. It's a chain of islands. You see that box, the small box here, it shows you where it is, and this is an enlargement of that. It's a 1,565-mile long archipelago of mostly small islands, but it only has 389 square miles of surface. Again, Magellan founded some of these islands when he was doing his around the world tour, and the Spanish claimed it in 1667. And it's a way station for what's called the Manila treasure fleet. Again, this was lost. The Guam was lost to the United States. The United States annexed Guam. The United States still owns Guam. I was looking for license plates in my neighborhood for many years, and I actually came across a car in Jackson Heights that had a Guam license plate on it. How that happened, I have no idea. And the Spanish sold the rest of the Mariana Islands to Germany in 1899, but they issued one set of stamps, Philippine stamps, overprinted in 1899, which we'll get a picture of right here. And Scott doesn't list Spanish Marianas, which it really should. They list this just under Mariana Islands, and then the German issues follow this, so it's one listing.
Are the Marianas you talk about the same ones that were used for nuclear testing?
Yes. It's a trust territory now for the U.S. Spanish Guinea. Here's our slide for Spanish Guinea. The little insert down here shows you the various pieces of Spanish Guinea. This issue here on the mainland which is sometimes known as Rio Muni. Here is Fernando Po up here, and there are a bunch of islands. Corisco is down here. Hello Bay is here, and Annobon, shown in this insert, is way the hell off down here. Okay, so in 1777, the Spanish settled their disputes with Portugal, and this is what they got. It's interesting that this is a nice long major river going into the African interior. This right here, this estuary, which is wide, but the rivers feeding it don't go very far into the interior. This is actually Rio Muni. That's why this area is known as Rio Muni. There was also problems with the British over what the boundaries of this place were, and they finally, in the Treaty of Paris in 1900, they settled on what the borders were. Annobon did not join until 1959, and again, all of these pieces are what constitutes Equatorial Guinea today. the countries that survived the Spanish-American War eventually started producing designs that were not simply the King of Spain in his various poses. This is King Alfonso the 13th here, but you also have some pictorial scenes of the of Spanish Guinea itself. And this was a set issued for Spanish Guinea, and then when the Republic, 1931, that seems early for me. I wonder if there's a problem with this. Well, anyway, overprinted Republic of Spain to the same set. Now we get to the most complicated of all of these things, that is Morocco. And this picture you have here shows what Morocco claims, and it shows you the physical arrangement of the country. The Atlas Mountain divides Morocco proper, which this line here is a border that Morocco says doesn't exist, but which most other people say does exist. So Morocco itself is divided into two parts by the Atlas Mountains, or this particular range called the High Atlas. And it divides the country in a variety of ways. The area to the west of the Atlas Mountains is relatively well watered, but the water hits the clouds and the water moisture hits the Atlas Mountains and falls there. And by the time you get on this side of the Atlas Mountains, you're in the desert. The desert area is mostly inhabited by Berbers and Berber tribes, nomads, and they've always been a disruptive feature of Moroccan political history. We'll get to that shortly. Morocco says this area here, which has a variety of names that we will also discuss shortly, they annexed it. They said, well, that's really historically part of Morocco. We own that. But they didn't take literally all of it to the colonial borders, which are these borders here. And in the desert, more desert areas, this thing called the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic exists. It has a temporary capital in this corner here of Algeria. And this line that goes down here is a berm, what they call a berm, or it's a minefield that the Moroccans have set up to keep the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, the Polisario Front, from attacking Western Sahara. So that's a very interesting situation. It lasts today. We'll get to that war. And here you can see where the Canary Islands are. They're off the coast of the southernmost part of Morocco. They're very close to the coast. Now, there's a lot of history that goes into this. Morocco has suffered European incursions for most of the later Middle Ages. The Europeans, as soon as they recovered from the Dark Ages, they started raiding the north coast of Africa, and all of these things like Ceuta and Melilla were occupied at one time or another by European powers. In the 18th century, they established a capitulation system in Morocco, in which the European representatives could give protection to their, quote, agents, unquote. And this became quite a source of income for the European powers, because they would make all sorts of people their agents for a price. And they were exempt from taxes or Moroccan law. Europeans mostly owned the coastal towns. Tangier was one of the first ones that became a major issue. Later on, the French heavily colonized Casablanca. And that became one of the biggest towns in Morocco. And the Moroccan government always tried to keep those Europeans in the coast. They didn't want them inland at all. The country has no particular exceptional natural resources, so the value is really strategic. Obviously, it forms the southern side of the Straits of Gibraltar. It's Spain's neighbor to the south. And France wants the hat trick. They owned Algeria and Tunisia. They said, we ought to have Morocco as well, so we'll have all of North Africa. So they were always interested. And this is a wonderful quote from this book, Douglas Porch, Conquest of Morocco. If you want an interesting read, this will give you all the details of all the nonsense that went on that I can't go into here. But he describes Morocco as an independent as a mouse, surrounded by several hungry cats, warily disputing who would carry off the dinner. And the main disputants were Spain and France, and Britain, Italy, the Ottoman Empire, and finally Germany were also all sticking their noses in that. Because this was the last part of Africa that was available to be taken over by British colonies. There were a couple of independent pieces, Liberia and Ethiopia were independent, but Morocco was sort of the last bit that be gobbled up. So there was a lot of activity around Morocco in the early 20th century. There was also a dispute among the French. The French diplomats wanted a slow takeover by giving the Moroccan government loans, which they couldn't repay, which would allow them to take more liberties with the government of Morocco. But the Algerian army was very bellicose, and they wanted to use the raids that the tribesmen were making on Algeria an excuse to simply go in and conquer the place. So that it was back and forth between these factions for quite a while. There was a rebel in Algeria named Abdel Kader, and Morocco shielded him. And there was a war between France and Morocco in 1844. And as a price of ending that war, Morocco recognized that, yes, the French owned Algeria. They had never admitted that before. The British had a treaty with Morocco that opened trade to the country and lowered the tariffs in 1856. And then in 1859 to 60, the Spanish had a war with the Moroccans over the borders of Ceuta, and the fact that, again, the mountains in the north are called the Rif Mountains. So there were a bunch of nomads and mountain peoples living in the Rif, and they were making raids on the Spanish city of Ceuta, and this was a cause for a war. The war ended, of course, with the Moroccan loss. The British had made a big loan to Morocco to pay off the war debt. The then Moroccan government recognized these little enclaves that Spain had on the coast. In 1884, there was the Berlin Conference that didn't particularly deal with Morocco, but these conferences held in Europe in the 19th century were always figured out how to divide up the rest of the world. So the outcome for Spain was that Spain declared a protectorate over Rio de Oro, which we'll get to a little further on. I could go through this, but if you're really interested, you should read it yourself. There are all of these ins and outs during the early 20th century of what's going on in Morocco. And the important ones to notice are the ones that the Germans caused, because there was a crisis in 1905 and another one in 1911. In 1905, the Kaiser actually visited Morocco. In 1911, they sent some gunboats off the coast of southern Morocco. And basically, this was a ploy by the Germans to get concessions to their colonial interests in the rest of Africa, and the Congo and Cameroons in particular. Germans were late to the colonial game. They were a major power in Europe, obviously, and they felt they were mistreated. They weren't given their just due in Africa, so they made these problems and had to be given concessions. So the final result is the 1912 Treaty of Fez, which formally created Morocco as protectorate, divided between Spain and France. And France got almost all of the territory, but the northern part of Morocco, the things closest to Spain, were part of the Spanish protectorate. And surprisingly, the very far south strip was also given as part of the Spanish protectorate. We'll get to the details of that later. And here's a map showing some of the border changes. I mentioned Rio de Oro. It was recognized as a Spanish protectorate in 1912. That's the southern part of what later became Spanish Sahara. This area was annexed later. The southern Morocco protectorate is also known as Cape Juby, which we will talk about. And the northern part was up here, but the borders changed around frequently. And here's some particular details of Spanish Sahara, which didn't have a border on the east originally. And then there was a border drawn, and then it was expanded into southern Morocco, and then it was made smaller in southern Morocco. It's very complicated. And the rights of the Moroccan government, such as it was, were just sort of whittled away bit by bit, along with territory and various types of dependency. This shows you 8 stages by which the French occupied their part of Morocco. Bit by bit, conquered. The tribes were subdued by various methods and so on. And here's what we'll talk about later. This is the little enclave called Ifni, which was Spanish, in the southern part of Morocco. Now here's the best maps if you want to know what's going on there. country. This is the northern part. This is the Spanish protectorate of Morocco, Spanish Morocco. This is Melilla here. This is Ceuta here, very strategic, right across the straits from Gibraltar. And this is the international zone of Tangier, where all the Europeans established their embassies and whatnot, the first trading area. And you can see even after the Treaty of Fez, there were different changes in the border at one time or another here and there. And there was fighting here, which we've already mentioned part of that. Now, that's the pink part on this map here. Cape Juby is the southern Moroccan protectorate. Ifni is the little enclave sticking into Morocco. And then this area, the southern part, it was originally called Rio de Oro. They issued stamps, as we'll see. Alhambra was added to it at some point. And this isn't even on the map, but the very southern tip, right down here, that's where this obscure place called La Agüera is located. Very, very complicated. Okay, Spanish Morocco itself. It issued stamps between 1903 and 1955. The album, the old Scott album, lists them as Spain, offices of Morocco. But the catalog, the current catalog, lists them as Spanish Morocco, separate country. And the original stamps were the stamps, current stamps of Spain, overprinted for Spanish Morocco. This is again a good art friend Alfonso XIII, and an overprinted Spanish stamp. And then, like many colonies, when they got in the 20s and 30s, they started issuing pictorial series, so the stamps become a little bit more interesting. This is a set for the Barcelona Exposition, French, Spanish stamps, overprinted Moroccan protectorate. 1937, this is issue. The Franco issues for Spanish Morocco are not listed as Spain revolutionary issues. They're just treated as stamps of Spanish Morocco. There were never any Republican stamps as such issued for Spanish Morocco. All of the issues were Francoist issues. Because again, Franco was the military commander of the Canary Islands. And when he raised his banner of revolt against the Spanish Republic, he immediately occupied the rest of Spanish Morocco. And there was a clean break there. Okay, and here's another different type of stamp. Seen for Spanish Morocco, special. This gives you a better geographical picture of Spanish Guinea and its parts. It was discovered in 1472, Portugal, Spain, 1778. And the names were changed, and the contents of the particular quote country unquote changed over the various years. It's finally settled down to be Equatorial Guinea, which includes the former colony of El Obey, Anaban, and Corisco, Spanish Guinea, and Fernando Po. Here is the 1903 to 6 issues. Again, these awful Alfonso XIII. That's just dates changed year after year. Rio de Oro, Spanish Sahara, Spanish West Africa, all more or less the same thing. They issued stamps from 1905 to 75 with an interruption. The Canary Islands are right off the coast of the area. The Portuguese discovered this in 1436. It's not an hospitable area, and Spain did not do anything until 1884 when they were formally given this particular area to be their colony, and they started occupying it. But they didn't use separate stamps until 1905. They used the stamps of Spain there. It was called Rio de Oro after 1904 when it was recognized by the other European powers as being a Spanish possession. So that's the stamps that are issued as Rio de Oro. 1922, La Agüera, which we'll see later, was added to it. In 1924, the Seguia Alhambra was added, and the name was changed from Rio de Oro to a more general Spanish Sahara. And that's the way it existed for most of its life. However, Scott has underneath the name in the catalog of Spanish Sahara, Spanish Western Sahara in parentheses, which is it does for a number of countries who were known as different names, but they list them as the same place. So from 1924, when Seguia Alhambra joined, it was called Spanish Western Sahara. The name was changed to Spanish Sahara. Cape Juby was added the southern part of Morocco, the Spanish Morocco, in 1946. And then from 1949 to 1951, it was called Spanish West Africa, and it also included that little enclave in Morocco called Ifni. And again, there were two slightly different names for Spanish West Africa. In 1958, they changed the name. Rio de Oro. Here is two of the Alfonso XIII sets. Okay, here's 1908 to 12, more Alfonso XIII, 1911 to 1919, even more Alfonso XIII, set after set of these stamps. 1920 to 21, yet more Alfonso XIII. Just goes on and on and on. All right, get out of there. Spanish Morocco issued stamps for the city of Tetuan, which is a city in the northern part of Spanish Morocco, in 1908. The Spanish stamps overprinted Tetuan. It's sort of odd. Again, this is the album, Spain, offices in Morocco. Tetuan essentially is an offices in Spain. That doesn't make any sense. They just say Tetuan here, and the numbers begin at one again, which is typical of offices. And the catalog says Spanish Morocco instead of Spain, and then they just list Tetuan as Tetuan. They don't list it as offices or anything. Cape Juby, the southern part of Spanish Morocco, was Spanish from 1904 to 1958, but they only issued stamps 16 through 46. Administratively, since it was right next to Spanish Sahara, it was occupied, administered from Spanish Sahara rather than from Spanish Morocco, which is mostly that strip of land on the north. And it started using stamps of Sahara from 1950. When the rest of Spanish Morocco got its independence in 1956, the Spanish kept this little piece, Cape Juby, in the southern part of Morocco. There was a war called the Ifni War between Spain and Morocco. And at the end of that war in 1856, Cape Juby became part of Morocco. Overprints on Spanish stamps early on. Later on, as with most countries in the 30s, they started issuing pictorial issues, and this is a Spanish Morocco overprinted Cape Juby airmail set. And you'll see it specifically says protectorate. They were very careful in some cases to distinguish between a colony and a protectorate. Cape Juby was part of a protectorate, not an outright colony like Spanish Sahara. Now here's La Guaira. This is the most strange and interesting piece. It's the southernmost tip of what we know mostly as Spanish Sahara. And it's this peninsula here. This is Cape Cabo Blanco, which is right here. This is La Agüera. And this is the border between Mauritania and La Agüera. They issued their own stamps, as you can see here, in the 1920s. Rio de Oro stamps overprinted, and then their own stamps in one of the Alfonso series. In 1924, they said, well, to heck with this tiny little thing. We'll just annex it to make it part of Spanish Sahara. And these days, it's basically abandoned. There's this tiny strip up here, which is where the Moroccans have drawn the border. And so Mauritania, in effect, has taken over this area and have occupied it. It was apparently a fairly prosperous fishing village for a number of years, but today it's basically abandoned. Spanish Sahara, when they added Cape Juby and La Agüera, they made it Spanish Sahara. And the first issues were Spanish Western Sahara. And here's the Spanish semi-postal issue, overprinted Spanish Sahara. Here it gives you a better view of the Tangier International Zone. The Spanish stamps used in Tangier are listed as Spanish Morocco Tangier. The other stamps used here, which were issued by the European powers, are listed as whatever the country issued them was, offices in Morocco. So they treat them differently in catalogs now. And here's a very interesting stamp. This is a semi-postal special delivery stamp, overprint on the equivalent Spanish stamp. Ifni, this little piece of southern Morocco that was carved out by Spain, the Spanish settled here in 1476, but then they later abandoned it. After the war with Morocco in 1860, the Moroccan government formally said, okay, you can have, Spain is yours. It said that you can have this. The European powers accepted this in 1904. They didn't really occupy it. They didn't send troops there and administer it until 1934, rather late in the day. Again, there was this war in 57 to 58 between Morocco and Spain. The result was that Spanish Juby became the southernmost part of Morocco proper. This lighter area here, that reverted to Morocco after the Ifni War. And only this area here, the city of Ifni itself, remains Spanish. And then finally, in 1969, Spanish gave up and Ifni became a part of Morocco. Ifni did issue its own stamps, starting in World War II, and stamps were only used in the city proper after 1958. And these are the usual post-World War II issues that you see for Spain and the few colonies that it had left at that point. Remember Rio Muni? I said Rio Muni was that big river at the southern end of what became Equatorial Guinea. Like Fernando Po in the 60s, it issued stamps in its own name, even though it was still part of Spanish Guinea. You have Fernando Po and Rio Muni issuing these typical Spanish colonial stamps. And it joined it became the Republic of Equatorial Guinea along with the Fernando Po and Elo Bay. Now, this is the last couple of slides. This is very interesting. This shows what happened in Spanish Sahara. This shows a bunch of occupations by Morocco of the country. In 1982, they covered this area, then they occupied this area, then they occupied this, and finally they took the final piece down here. But they built this berm, which is basically a minefield to keep the people who live in the eastern part of Western Sahara out of the Moroccan claims. This area, in general, is one of the least densely populated areas in the world. There are 105,000 square miles and only 600,000 people. The only competitors it has are like Greenland, Pitcairn Islands, and a few places like that that are less densely populated. There are not particularly any great resources here, so no one's fighting over it. It's just desert. Spain basically gave up on Spanish Sahara in 1976. And they said, we're throwing up our hands. Morocco and Mauritania, who border this, you can have it. But the International Court of Justice said that neither of those countries had a claim on the area. But of course, the Moroccans ignored that. The people in the eastern part of the country were, for a while, were ruled by Mauritania, but then Mauritania very quickly gave up. The UN has accepted the Polisario Liberation Front as a legitimate representatives, and they formed something called the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, with its capital just off the map here in Algeria. And I have two different reports of how many countries in the world recognize this, either 84 or 44 plus South Ossetia, which is not self-recognized as a country. And it's a member of the African Union, but it is not a member of the UPU. So if you've got some mail from here, you've got something that's not kosher. Mauritania, after 3 years, says, we don't want to have anything to do with this. It's just a mess. We give up our claim. But it says, again, this strip down here and going down to La Agüera is still occupied Mauritania. The people, the headquarters off over here, they don't really have much control over this area, the berm that Morocco has built. The only countries that recognize Morocco's annexation of this area are France and the United States. And Jared Kushner signed the Treaty of Israeli-Moroccan Normalization, which for some reason includes the United States recognizing Morocco's annexation of the area. 2020. So that's where it stands right now. These are philatelic or propaganda stamps. They're not really useful for postage. And here's a flora and fauna set from 1992. So that, folks, is all she wrote. It's really complicated, especially in the Morocco area.
Wow.
That was
That's
great,
really,
Phil.
really
Really,
something, Phil. You mentioned the scramble among the European powers for Morocco. Um, Prior to that scramble, was Morocco an independent country? Did it have a king, or what kind of government did it have?
Had a sultan.
Uh-huh.
Uh, the book I mentioned there is very interesting because it tells you how truly medieval the place was in the 19th, even by the late 19th century. The Sultan was a descendant of the Prophet. He was a Sharif, and he had to be recognized by the religious authorities, or he basically didn't have any authority. They call that in Morocco, it's called baraka. And there were civil wars almost constantly. None of the tribes were really forced to recognize the king's sovereignty. They had various reasons that they would or would not recognize it at various times. There were constant pretenders, rebellions. The tribes were semi-autonomous. I mean, they didn't have any foreign policy. Their foreign policy was how they dealt with their neighbors. And they never got very good at modern warfare during the colonial era. It was always this brave men riding out from the mob to challenge the champion of the other side and showing that they were very brave. They could ride up to the foreign army and take shots at them and survive that. They never got any good at fixed warfare. So it was just a matter of time before the Europeans said enough of this and we're going to take over and run things our own way. And they did. And so you saw that map of French Morocco. They spent decades subduing first this part of the country and then this part of the other part of the country. And there were rebellions and so on. It was quite a mess in there. But yes, there was an independent supposed ruler of all of Morocco. That Morocco had originally been the home of two major dynasties, one of which, actually both of which ruled most of Spain for quite a while. It had a tradition of monarchy, but it wasn't an organized place.
I'd like to show you two covers from my fraud collection with the question to you, what can you tell me about these two covers? Here's the first cover. It's addressed to Professor Segno, who sold Success Waves, just to give a little background. Well, it's a registered letter from Santa Isabel and Fernando Po.
The map that I showed shows Santa Isabel is the name of the tallest peak.
Ah, okay.
So I don't know. Obviously, it's a town somewhere, but the map does not show it as an actual town. The return address thing there is Guinea Espanol, Spanish Guinea. So this is during the period when Fernando Po was not issuing its own stamps. It was just part of Spanish Guinea.
There are the stamps.
Yes.
June 1914. It's a 665 centimos registered rate, and it seems to have gone through the mail with no problem. Each post office puts its registry number. This is definitely a United States one here. This may well be Fernando Po, their registry number for this particular registered piece. Sometimes there are a lot more. I'm not sure what all of this red markings are that have been crossed out.
it looks like an X, right? But I believe English registry covers
usually English
have a like a crayon that's in a kind of a cross.
This looks like to me somebody was trying to write something here and then crossed it out.
The X on registered covers is seen on other nationalities other than British.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it on Greek and other Balkan area covers.
There's no evidence this had passed through anything English, and you can see from the back it did go up to Madrid and properly over to New York and then Los Angeles. Okay, let me get to the other one, and this is from now Safi, Spanish Morocco. You can see it is registered. Actually, it does have, yeah, that X. Actually, it's got two. This might been through something British. Let me just show you a close-up of the stamp so you can see the overprint here in red.
Yeah, that's the early issues of Spanish stamps, overprinted Spanish Morocco.
Okay. And then we have the
What's the date? 1912. This is that's interesting. I don't know the exact date of the Treaty of Fez, which created the formal republic, but it was 1912 at some point.
and again, you see this went up via Madrid and then to New York and out to Los Angeles. But here are two examples of these stamps properly used on registered letters, and of course it's to Professor Segno's operations. I thought you might enjoy that as